When history hits home, the soldier who faced the pain of his own people. Welcome to our channel. Today we have a powerful story about tradition, history, and the conflict between duty and culture. In this video, we delve into an unforgettable moment when a royal guard, stationed in Wales to protect a priceless historical artifact, faced a dilemma that would stir controversy and ignite a debate on national identity. Watch as emotions run high, history is questioned, and the silent strength of duty takes center stage. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and share your thoughts on the story. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because we have many more powerful stories coming your way. Starting tomorrow. The Queen's Guard, an iconic symbol of the British monarchy, stood tall as they prepared for a mission unlike any other. On a crisp early morning, a group of Grenadier Guards was tasked with an extraordinary responsibility, escorting a priceless national treasure. This treasure was none other than the sword of King Edward I, a relic steeped in centuries of history and power. The blade was set to be displayed at a museum in Wales as part of a cultural collaboration to honor the shared history between the nations of the United Kingdom. The mission seemed simple enough: protect the sword, transport it safely, and ensure the event ran smoothly. What could possibly go wrong? The team of guards, clad in their signature red tunics and bearskin hats, marched with precision and discipline. As they made their way to the museum, the atmosphere was filled with reverence, both for the artifact and the task at hand. News outlets across the UK reported the event as a symbol of unity, a bridge between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The sword, with its ancient origins, was said to represent the shared history of the United Kingdom, a history that had shaped the very fabric of the nation. But as they arrived in Wales, a sense of unease began to take hold. What was meant to be a celebratory occasion soon turned into something more tense and complicated. A group of local Welsh protesters had gathered outside the museum, holding signs and chanting in opposition to the display of the sword. The banners read, "A symbol of oppression, and not our history, not our treasure." The protesters viewed the sword not as a historic artifact, but as a symbol of England's dominance over Wales, a painful reminder of the conquest and subjugation their ancestors had suffered. For them, this was more than a relic. It was a representation of a past that they were still living with in their memories. As the guards approached the protesters, the air grew thick with tension. The protesters were passionate, their voices rising in anger. One young man stepped forward, shouting directly at the guards, accusing them of standing in the shadow of history's oppressors. He pointed at the sword and demanded to know why. They were protecting such a symbol of violence and conquest. The words cut through the silence, but the guards remained unmoved. They were trained to stand stoic and silent, to protect and serve without ever engaging in political matters. Their role was to preserve order, not to take sides in debates about history or identity. But for the men and women in uniform, it was more complicated than that. Among them was Sergeant Thomas Aldridge, a 32-year-old soldier with a deep connection to Wales. Born and raised in Cardiff, he understood both sides of the argument. He knew the pride the Welsh had in their culture, and the wounds that were still raw from centuries of English dominance. Yet, as a soldier, his duty was clear. He was to protect the relic, no matter its meaning. But standing there, facing the protesters, he couldn't help but feel torn. He had heard the whispers of anger among the crowds, seen the looks of disdain as the locals viewed the uniform he wore. A part of him understood their pain, their need to assert their identity, to reject what they saw as an imposition. And yet another part of him felt the weight of tradition, the centuries of history that had shaped him into the man he was. It was a silent struggle within him, one that he would carry as the day unfolded. The scene grew even more charged as a protester reached out and slapped the side of the display case containing the sword. The sound of the strike echoed through the air, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. The guards stood tall, doing nothing but watching, keeping their discipline intact, yet their silence seemed to fuel the growing tension. The protesters' cries grew louder, their anger more palpable, and in that moment, the mission they had set out to complete with such precision seemed increasingly impossible. As they prepared to enter the museum, Sergeant Aldridge caught the eye of one of the protesters, a young woman who had been holding a sign. Her gaze was filled with sorrow and disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how someone from her own homeland could stand there, guarding a symbol of their subjugation. For a split second, their eyes met, and Aldridge's heart sank. He had lived through his own battles, but this was different. This wasn't a battle with weapons or enemies. It was a battle with history itself. The events that followed would test Aldridge's resolve in ways he never anticipated. Would he stand by his duty to the crown, or would he find himself questioning everything he had been taught? The clash between his sense of duty and the anger of his people would soon escalate into a much larger conflict, one that would ripple through the nation. But for now, the sword was safe. The mission was far from over, and the story was only just beginning. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. The protesters' chants echoed through the streets, and their presence seemed to grow with each passing minute. Sergeant Aldridge, now standing guard just a few feet away from the prized relic, felt the weight of history bearing down on him. The sharp stares of the locals pierced through his uniform, and despite his training to remain composed, he could feel the pressure building. He had always been a man of duty, a man who had served his country with honor in the heat of battle. But this felt different. This wasn't a battlefield with clear lines, clear enemies. This was a battleground of ideologies, one where the sword he was tasked with protecting was a symbol of oppression for the people who lived here. The protesters were relentless. They surrounded the museum's entrance, chanting louder with each minute. Their voices, fueled by years of frustration, rang through the crisp Welsh air like a battle cry. One protester, a young man with fiery eyes, stepped forward, face to face with Sergeant Aldridge. His words were sharp, cutting through the silence. "Do you even know what that sword represents? It represents centuries of pain and suffering. And here you are, protecting it like it's some national treasure. You're just a puppet of the system." Aldridge didn't flinch. He'd heard these accusations before, on the battlefield, in the heat of war, in moments where every word, every breath could turn into violence. But here, there was no fighting. His job was simple: stand still, protect, and stay silent. But with every word thrown at him, every accusation, his resolve was being tested. The young protester's voice grew louder, his face inches from Aldridge's. A camera flashed nearby, capturing every moment. Soon the video went viral. The headline, "Royal Guard stands silent in the face of history's judgment." By the time Aldridge returned to his post, the media storm had already begun. The headlines flooded in, some sympathetic, others scathing. News outlets split into two camps. One side hailed him as the epitome of military discipline, unshaken, unwavering in his commitment to the crown. The other, however, couldn't hide their outrage. How can we allow this kind of military presence in a cultural event? They asked. This isn't a time for tradition, this is a time for truth. The silence was deafening, but in it, Aldridge could hear the echo of the protesters' words. He wasn't just guarding an artifact, he was guarding a piece of history that had caused pain, division, and anger. And despite the justification for his duty, there was an undeniable feeling of conflict in his chest. Hours passed, and the protesters grew more agitated. A few of them, now emboldened by the media attention, made their way inside the museum. They weren't there to admire the artifact. They were there to protest it, to claim it as a symbol of their own oppression. One of them, a woman with fierce determination in her eyes, approached the glass case containing the sword. She stared at it for a long moment, her face twisted in a mix of defiance and sorrow. Without warning, she stepped forward, her hand reaching toward the artifact. In an instant, Aldridge moved. His military training kicked in. He blocked her path, positioning himself between her and the sword. But instead of using force, he used his body, his stance as a human barrier, firm but non-confrontational. He didn't touch her, didn't shout at her. He simply stood, an immovable figure, blocking her access. His eyes met hers for a brief moment, a silent communication passing between them. Yet to the growing crowd outside, it was as if the barrier between the protesters and the royal guard had become even thicker. The protesters, seeing Aldridge's movement, misinterpreted it. They saw a man in uniform stopping a woman from expressing her voice, and it only fanned the flames of their anger. They began shouting even louder, accusing the guards of trying to suppress their freedom of speech. Aldridge remained composed, the weight of his responsibility heavier than ever. He knew this moment was more than just about keeping the sword. It was about keeping the peace. Peace not just for the crown, but for the people of Wales, too. He had to stand firm, to remain resolute in his role, even as the world around him seemed to crumble into chaos. By the time the incident made it to the news outlets, it was already being spun into a political debate. The headlines screamed about military intervention at a cultural event, and soon the protests went beyond the walls of the museum. The streets of Wales were filled with calls for the royal guard to be removed from the event, and the calls for justice only grew louder. For Aldridge, there was no easy way out of this. He was caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: duty, honor, history, the people he was tasked to protect, and the people who felt betrayed by him. But as the protests continued to rage, Aldridge knew one thing for certain. This was a battle. He couldn't win with force. This wasn't a fight he could fight with weapons. It was a fight of ideals. And the sword? It wasn't just a relic. It was a symbol of everything that had come before and everything that had yet to come. As the days passed, the tension between the royal guard and the Welsh protesters continued to escalate. The protests outside the museum grew larger, more vocal, and more organized. News outlets from across the UK were now focused on the story, dividing the nation into two polarized camps: those who saw the royal guard as symbols of order and honor, and those who viewed them as agents of oppression, blindly serving an imperial past. Sergeant Aldridge, caught in the middle of it all, could feel the weight of this divide pressing down on him. But for Aldridge, the conflict wasn't just external, it was deeply internal. He had always been proud of his service to the crown, of his duty to protect and serve. But as he stood guard over the sword, a symbol of England's domination over Wales, he felt torn. This sword, which had once belonged to King Edward III, was not just a relic. It was a reminder of the violent history that had shaped the relationship between Wales and England. And yet, as a soldier, his duty was clear. He wasn't there to question history. He was there to protect the artifact and ensure its safety. But how could he stand in front of something that represented so much pain for the people of Wales? How could he stand there, a man from Cardiff in the very heart of his homeland, while the people around him saw him as part of an oppressive system? One evening, after a long day of duty, Aldridge walked back to his quarters in the museum. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The protests had drained him. He had spent the past few days staring at the same stone walls, hearing the same chants and accusations. But it was a conversation he had with a local museum guide that had really begun to shake him. The guide, a young woman named Rhiannon, had pulled him aside earlier in the day. She had been one of the most vocal critics of the museum's decision to display the sword. "Why would a man like you," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the protests, "stand here and protect this symbol of our suffering? You're from Cardiff. You should understand what it means." Aldridge hadn't known how to respond. He had heard her words, but they hadn't fully sunk in until later that night. Rhiannon's voice echoed in his mind as he sat in the dimly lit room, staring at the wall. "Why would you protect this?" Her words haunted him. He knew she wasn't the only one who felt that way. For so many, the sword was not just a symbol of English power, it was a reminder of their history of subjugation. And Aldridge, despite All his training, despite his years of service, was now caught in the middle of that history. It was in the quiet of that night that Aldridge began to feel the crushing weight of the situation. He had always thought of himself as a protector, a man who followed orders, a man who stood tall in the face of danger. But here in Wales, in the place he had once called home, he began to question what it really meant to protect. Was he protecting the right thing? Was he standing up for something worth defending? The very next morning, the museum was bustling with activity, and the protests had only intensified. The media was now calling the situation a cultural crisis. It wasn't just about the sword anymore. It was about identity, about the right of the Welsh people to control their own narrative, to define their own history, without the weight of English oppression hanging over them. As Aldridge made his way to the museum's front entrance, he was stopped by one of the protest leaders, a man named Gareth. Gareth had been one of the most vocal figures in the protests, and he wasn't about to let Aldridge off easy. He stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "You're part of this system, aren't you?" Gareth spat, his voice full of venom. "You stand there, in your uniform, pretending you're just doing your job. But you're not. You're a part of the very thing that has oppressed my people for centuries. You wear that uniform like it gives you the right to be here, to control what we see, what we experience, what we remember. But we won't stand for it anymore." Aldridge froze. He had heard these accusations 1,000 times before, but today, they felt different. They felt personal. For the first time, he didn't know how to respond. He wanted to say something, anything, to defend himself, to justify his presence there. But the words wouldn't come. He could only stand there, silent, as the weight of his uniform and the anger of the protesters crushed him. Gareth didn't wait for an answer. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of protesters. But Aldridge remained, frozen in place, the words ringing in his ears. Was he really just a tool of the system? Or was there more to his role, more to his duty than he had ever realized? In that moment, as he stood in the midst of the growing chaos, Aldridge felt something inside him shift. The battle he was facing wasn't just one of external protest. It was a battle for his own understanding of what it meant to serve. And with every passing moment, that battle became more personal, more profound. The protests weren't going away, and neither were the questions swirling in his mind. But Aldridge had no choice but to keep moving forward. The sword would be displayed. The protests would continue. But what would happen to him, to his sense of duty, was still uncertain. The situation had reached a breaking point. The protests outside the museum had escalated to a fever pitch. What had begun as a simple cultural exchange, a ceremonial act, meant to unite the nations of the United Kingdom, had now become a battleground of history, identity, and power. The sword, once a symbol of national pride, had transformed into a symbol of division. And Sergeant Thomas Aldridge, standing at the heart of it all, felt the crushing weight of that division. It was the day of the sword's public display. The media was already gathered, cameras flashing as reporters crowded around the entrance. The protesters were there too, their chants echoing through the streets, demanding justice, demanding the removal of the sword from public view. It wasn't just a protest anymore. It was a movement. And Aldridge, standing in his uniform, holding his position by the artifact, was at the center of it all. But things were about to take a dangerous turn. A small group of radicals whose anger had been building for days had planned an act of defiance. Their goal was clear. They would not let the sword remain untouched. As Aldridge stood in front of the display case, maintaining his unwavering stance, a figure appeared in the crowd. A young man, his face twisted with rage, pushed forward. In his hand, he held a can of spray paint, an act of protest meant to defile the relic. In a split second, Aldridge's instincts kicked in. He moved quickly, positioning himself between the protester and the display case. The young man, undeterred, tried to push past him. Without hesitation, Aldridge raised his arm, using his body as a human barrier. He didn't touch the protester. He didn't push him. He simply stood firm, blocking the path with his military-trained posture, creating a wall of strength and resolve. But what happened next wasn't what Aldridge expected. The protester, now visibly frustrated, shouted at him, "What are you doing? You're protecting their history, their lies." His voice cracked with emotion as he pointed at the sword. "You're just another pawn in their game. Don't you see? This is our history too, and it's been stolen from us for centuries." The words hit Aldridge harder than he cared to admit. For a moment he stood there, silent, frozen by the sheer intensity of the protesters' anger. The crowd around them began to stir, some supporting the protester, others calling out to Aldridge to step aside. The tension was palpable, and in that moment Aldridge knew that this was no longer just about protecting an artifact. It was about protecting his own beliefs, his identity, and his duty. As the protester pushed harder, Aldridge's grip tightened on his rifle, the weight of the weapon now serving as a reminder of the responsibilities he bore. He could feel his heartbeat racing in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through him. But he couldn't give in to that. He had been trained for this, for confrontation, for control. He couldn't let this man or the crowd break him. But the protester wasn't done. He reached out, pushing against Aldridge with all his might, trying to shove him aside. The can of spray paint glinted in the sunlight as it swung toward the sword. Aldridge's body moved on instinct. He didn't think, he acted. In one swift motion he raised his hand, using his elbow to deflect the protester's arm. The can flew out of his hand, clattering to the ground. The crowd gasped. For a brief moment, everything went still. The protester, eyes wide with shock, looked at Aldridge, his anger still burning, but now with a flicker of disbelief. Aldridge's voice was calm, but firm. "I'm not here to fight you," he said, his eyes locking with the protesters. "I'm here to protect this place, to protect what we can all learn from it. We don't have to agree on everything, but we must respect each other's right to speak." The words felt hollow, even as they left his lips. And deep down, Aldridge knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him. But more than that, he could feel the weight of history, of centuries of anger and resentment, bearing down on his shoulders. Was it enough? Was standing firm in his duty enough to bridge the gap between two worlds, between the past and the present? The protester stood silent for a moment, seemingly at a loss for words. The crowd was still, waiting for the next move. The silence stretched out, suffocating, until the young man finally spoke again, his voice quieter now. "You don't understand," he muttered, his anger still simmering but with a hint of defeat. "You never will." And with that he turned, slipping into the crowd, leaving Aldridge standing there, alone with the weight of his uniform, the weight of his duty, and the weight of the question that haunted him. Was this the right thing to do? In the aftermath of the incident, the museum was in turmoil. The sword was still on display, but the protesters had grown more vocal, more divided. The media had a field day, spinning the event into a political statement, questioning the role of the Royal Guard in cultural events. And through it all, Aldridge remained silent. He had done his job, had protected the sword, had kept the peace. But what he had learned in that moment was something deeper, something far more profound. Protecting history, protecting the past, wasn't as simple as following orders. It was about understanding the past, acknowledging its pain, and finding a way to move forward together. The days that followed the incident were a blur of headlines, debates, and public outcry. The viral footage of Aldridge standing as an unyielding barrier between the protester and the sword had become the focal point of the ongoing crisis. Some hailed him as a hero, a man who had maintained his composure in the face of provocation. Others, however, saw him as an enabler of oppression, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in Wales's history. But in the midst of the media storm, Aldridge couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something had changed inside him. The protester's words, the anger, the history, the pain in his voice had stayed with him. He had stood firm in his duty, true to his training. But had he really protected what was right? Or had he merely followed orders, blind to the deeper implications of his actions. Late one evening, when the noise of the protests had finally settled into an uneasy quiet, Aldrich sat alone in his room at the museum. He stared at the wall, the same wall he had faced countless times in his years of service. Yet tonight, it felt different. Tonight, the uniform felt heavier. The honor he had always worn so proudly now felt like a weight, not a shield. The question swirled in his mind. Was he truly the protector of history, or was he just a man, caught between two worlds, doing what he thought was right without fully understanding the consequences? It was then that a letter arrived, the seal of the Royal Museum affixed to the front. Aldrich opened it, the paper feeling like it was made of something more than just ink and parchment. It was a letter from the museum's director inviting him to return, not as a guard, but as a speaker. The museum wanted him to address the very issue that had turned his life upside down. The letter was signed by Dr. Eleanor Williams, the director of the museum, who had witnessed the entire ordeal and understood the weight Aldrich was carrying. The words on the page were simple, yet profound. "We need you to speak not only for the crown, but for the people. To share your thoughts, your experience, and your understanding of the events that transpired, not just as a soldier, but as a man who has faced the heart of a cultural conflict." For the first time in days, Aldrich felt a sense of clarity. This wasn't about defending the sword anymore. This was about understanding the perspectives of the people of Wales and the role history played in shaping their identity. It was about showing that, while he wore the uniform, he was still a person, someone who could listen, learn, and most importantly, empathize. The next morning, Aldrich stood before a crowd in the museum's grand hall, the very place where the sword had been displayed. The room was filled with local leaders, cultural activists, and a few members of the press. The air was thick with expectation. As Aldrich stepped up to the podium, his eyes scanned the room. He saw Rhiannon, the museum guide, standing at the back, her eyes locked on him. He saw a few familiar faces from the protests, their expressions guarded but curious. The weight of the moment hung in the air. Aldrich cleared his throat, and for a brief moment the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady but tinged with the rawness of the emotions he had been carrying. "I'm not here to defend the sword. I'm not here to make excuses for what's happened. What I am here to do is to listen to the voices that have been calling for change, for justice, and for a chance to rewrite the narrative that has long been told by those in power." The room was still. Every eye was on him. "I am a soldier. I was trained to protect and serve, and in doing so, I've spent my life standing guard over many things. Buildings, artifacts, ideals. But this is different. I stood guard over a symbol of a past that many in this room, and many outside these walls, cannot forget. A past that carries pain, suffering, and injustice. And I've come to realize that my duty as a soldier isn't just to protect the crown. It's to understand the people I'm protecting. To understand their struggles, their histories, their pain." Aldrich paused, letting the words sink in. The crowd was quiet, absorbed in what he was saying. He could see the skepticism in their eyes, but he also saw something else. Something softer, a willingness to listen. "Some of you may think that I'm just a man in uniform following orders, but what I've learned over these past few days is that no man is just a uniform. We are all shaped by the world around us, by the histories that we carry, by the choices we make. And the truth is, protecting history isn't about defending it blindly. It's about learning from it. It's about acknowledging the pain it has caused and doing everything we can to ensure that the future is better than the past." He paused again, his heart heavy but his words resolute. "I didn't choose to stand here to protect an artifact. I chose to stand here to protect the future we can all share. A future where we acknowledge the past, learn from it, and move forward together." As Aldrich finished, the room remained quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, the applause began, soft at first, hesitant, but it grew, echoing through the hall. It wasn't the applause of victory. It wasn't a triumph. It was the sound of understanding, the sound of a man who had learned to listen, and a community that was willing to heal. For Aldridge, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of duty, a duty not just to protect but to understand, to learn, and to grow. What do you think? Is it enough to stand in silence, or do we need to confront the past to truly move forward? Sergeant Aldridge's story raises so many questions about duty, history, and identity. He was caught between two worlds, his duty as a soldier and the anger of the people he was tasked with protecting. Did he make the right choice? Should he have done more to address the pain of the past? Or was his role to remain silent and protect? The artifacts of history, no matter the cost, we want to hear from you. Was Aldridge's decision a moment of personal growth, or was it a failure to act when it mattered most? Do you think soldiers should remain neutral in cultural conflicts, or should they take a stand in difficult times? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Share your thoughts on duty, history, and the responsibility we have to learn from our past. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this with your friends. Let's keep this conversation going and explore how we can all grow from these difficult moments.